All right, guys. Good seeing everybody. I think we'll dive in here. So just kind of give a little review of what we covered last week. So what we did was I basically was presenting a roadmap for the course, what to expect, what we're going to be tackling as we go through the next several weeks. So we started out talking about, well, one of the basic steps of parenting is, well, first figuring out where are you. Before you can start actually making a plan, figuring out, what sort of, what techniques do you need to use, what sort of plans you need to set before you set an actual goal. What's most important is figure out, well, where are you? That really largely determines how you're going to be able to pick the goals you're going to pick and how you're going to achieve them. I mean, you can't, putting it another way, you can't really get to point B unless you start at point A. Where you stand, where you begin and knowing where you stand is probably the most important part of any sort of approach that you're going to have with, well, kids or a spouse or really anybody. Getting clarity on that is really getting clarity on the world you live in. And, it kind of in a certain respect is taking seriously the facts of your life. Any advice, any sort of parenting strategies, without that context, really end up being empty facts. And what's most important is filling in that meaning. What is it that makes your life the way it is? What is it that makes you you? What makes your kids who they are? That's really where the meaning's found. And once you have that sense of meaning, well, then you can push forward and figure out once you figure out, well, who you are, you know how to ask the right question of how to take who you are to put that person where you want them to be. Well, in this case, knowing your kids, and taking that particular kid and putting them where you want him or her to be. So that was really the first step. The second step was then figuring out, okay, well, fine, now that I know who I am, is really actually setting those goals. What specifically are you aiming for? Having an overall, less of a parenting strategy, but more of like a meta way, more of a meta way of looking at what you want to achieve as a parent. And I offer some suggestions, ideas of, well, trying to play off this idea of, well, whatever makes people unique is probably what we want to encourage. But I think, the bottom line of what I was trying to get across is whatever those meta goals are going to be, they need to reflect your personal values, what you hope for your kid. Setting him up so that he can not just survive life, but thrive in his life. So that he himself, or he or she can figure out who they are, when they become teens, when they become young adults. And to be able to set the goals that will make their lives meaningful, well, that really starts with the parenting that we give them. And so that's really, however you want to splice, these meta values. That's more or less the point I was trying to make. And I sent the assessment, and kind of in line with that, thinking, hey, I sent you all the assessments, and so thank you for getting those back to me, and I'm going to check them, and I need a little more time to finish them off, but I'll be able to get these back to you so that, like I said, so you can find your footing as you push forward in this course. All right, pushing ahead in some new territory. Tonight, what we're going to cover is the 4 basic parenting types that's found in the research. The first 3 turning out being the most problematic, and the 4th actually having a lot of success. So we'll be covering parenting types. And what I also wanted to cover was marriage, the different types of marriages that exist. Not every couple is the same, and we're going to get into that one and branch off into outlining, well, what makes a good marriage? What are the certain, traits or characteristics that make a good marriage? What do good partners do with one another? And I want to share with you a little bit of my research that I did here in Yerushalayim, looking at again, looking at how parents and marriage quality does affect the kids, and developing that point that we talked about last week. And finally, I wanted to cover how to start thinking differently about behaviors. As a first step in doing any sort of intervention with your kid, first we need to have the data. First, we need to figure out what's going on, have boots on the ground, and it demands it's not just a higher level of observing our kids, but with intention, noticing from beginning to end what their lives are like, and kind of like really like a hawk watching what's going on, so that you can start piecing together what are these patterns of behavior that are problematic. So we're going to cover something called chain analysis, where we're just that, kind of looking at behaviors as little micro behaviors making up a chain, and using that as a type of roadmap to figure out, okay, great. Now that we kind of see how these bad patterns unfold, it becomes a map to see, well, what once we've filled in the gaps of all the different types of techniques we're going to learn together, well, where can you put those techniques in this map to turn things around, to start seeing the behavior change you want to see, and help your kids get on the right track. All right. So Baumrind has done a lot of research. He really started, the not only starting in the field, but opening up this door of really spelling out clearly, well, what are the different types of parenting that we do? And in her research, and people that followed her, basically outlined 3 different parenting types that are problematic, that do end up doing more harm than good. So we're going to review these 3, and then I want to move into, well, what's this 4th type that actually does get traction, that has been shown to be really effective way of looking at parenting. So the first is the neglecting type. Now, before diving into this, I want to say, as far as researchers go, they're not the most creative or tactful when it comes to naming these things, but they get to the point, and how you label something, you try and figure out what's the most accurate, truthful way of labeling it, and so it might not be so kind, but definitely gets to the point. And so the first parent type is the neglecting type. And this kind of has 3 parts to it. The first is that these sort of parents are very rejecting of feelings. It's almost like, when negative feelings strike, kids screaming, kids wailing, or feeling some intense sad emotions. The parent wants it just to stop, get it to disappear as quickly as it popped up. Part of this is really this sort of like maybe underlying belief that, the kids are irrational. What does he have to worry about? I mean, after all, he's a kid. There's a certain sense of, say, a lack of emotional awareness. Emotions are a funny thing. Like I mentioned last week, that we kind of think of emotions as, in many ways, as our identities, but no, like emotions are just like seeing or hearing. They actually give us information. And so this sort of parenting type that almost blacklists negative emotions, well, that really almost tries to erase a large part of life. The second part of this is these sorts of parents are very lax in their behavioral control of kids. That there really isn't this quality of problem solving. It's more of this, again, this avoidance, like get these feelings out. These feelings are bad. Don't touch these feelings. And again, this underlying belief is, well, it's not that these feelings are going to harm the kid. They're going to harm the parent. It's almost like these negative feelings are like playing with fire. You just don't touch them. It might even develop into something more scary for parents, that it's not just that feelings are harmful, But parents, a lot of times, if they're coming from this way of looking at things, become terrified of what they could do, that what these feelings might make them do. These feelings might push them to become wrathful, to hurt their kids in a way that they'll regret later. And I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, we definitely don't want to put our resentment on kids, and that's one reason why it's so important to line up our parenting consciously with forethought, because to say that being a parent is difficult is an understatement. Kids are going to have meltdowns. Kids are going to have tantrums. And a part of us, kind of sounds bad to say it, but a part of us really does resent when they do that. The embarrassment that we suffer in public as the kid's having a meltdown in the supermarket. No, I'm not giving you that lollipop. And we might be able to keep ourselves more or less put together in those moments. But give it an hour. Once we get home, sitting at our desk, and our kid comes to us wanting to show the art they just made. Well, how much of that resentment we were experiencing in the supermarket is going into our response, not now, I'm working? There's a part. And so, it is something to take seriously, that, well, maybe feelings do motivate us to have resentment. But at the same time, it's also not a strategy to avoid them either. And lastly, with this parenting type, like I said, that there's this overemphasis on avoiding feelings. Well, there's also an overemphasis on positive feelings. That's a should, that almost like a rule that's made in the family, that you have to feel good. And if you don't, well, there's something wrong. It's not allowed to have anything but positive feelings. And what researchers have found, Gottman specifically has come out with some good work on this, is that it usually is the case that these sort of parents, well, early on they took the role of rescuer, when they were young, and almost kind of, caretaker for their own parents. That early on they were taking on too much responsibility, missing out on their own childhood. And that a lot was riding on them keeping a stiff upper lip. In that sort of situation, a kid who ends up having to be a parent to his parents, geez, I mean, you don't get to show negative feelings. There's no room for that in that sort of child-parent relationship. In many ways, a kid like that who, honestly, as a rescuer, as a caretaker, kids don't have those skills. The best they can do is avoid the pain and try and focus on the good. As far as what comes out in the research, the outcomes of this sort of parenting strategy, what we see is, children generally develop this inability to trust themselves. Like I said, a large part of their feelings are blacklisted. So, well, you can't trust your feelings. They're bad. And you start ending up being put in this position where you really can't trust yourself fundamentally. And as try as you might, you can't avoid these negative feelings anyway. So it has this added flavor of, well, it's not just you can't trust yourself, but there's this feeling there's something wrong with you, because there's all these negative feelings that keep popping up. And again, this rule in the family, this personal rule that develops, well, they shouldn't pop up. You can't help but feeling that you're wrong or bad. So, self-esteem definitely takes a nosedive. Academic success takes a nosedive. Success in school takes a nosedive. And this combination of ignoring negative feelings and not having the practical behavioral skills to problem solve, avoid, ends up fragilizing kids. They don't have the ability to regulate their emotions. more than that, not being able to regulate emotions and not having problem solving skills. Well, those are vital in being able to be social, to make friends, and to be able to get on in society. And so that, the research bears out, is fundamentally harmed. And like not doing well in society, not being able to regulate emotions, well, that goes a long way in explaining that within this group there's a dramatic deficit in being able to concentrate and pay attention. The deficits in memory and recall. So all these things, are really the consequences of this parenting strategy. And out of all three, it happens to be the most severe. And I think what might go into explaining that is, out of all the other parenting strategy, well, this one, like I said, is avoidance. It's a funny thing. It doesn't matter what sort of therapeutic background you come from or your philosophy of treatment. Psychodynamic, cognitive, behavioral. These therapies are very different, but what's kind of cool is that the one common denominator amongst all of them, the one thing that they can all agree on, despite all the massive disagreement, is the need to be able to willingly face the things that cause fear, and the knowledge that when we run away from the things that cause us fear, the more we're harmed. In biological studies, when we are confronted with things that cause us fear, that cause us terror, well, our body is flooded with cortisol. That stuff is toxic. That really wears away at the body. It wears away at the mind. The more and more you have experiences where you're constantly being triggered, cortisol is flooding the body, the more easy it is to become triggered. So this problem is a problem that grows every single time that you're confronted with your fear and you run away. The more that you run away from what causes fear, the more terrifying those things become. But when you set up a person to willingly, to openly confront those things that cause them fear, well, what ends up happening is the human body reacts in a dramatically different way. The body is not flooded with cortisol, and instead of becoming fragile and in many ways broken by this repeated onslaught, people actually get tougher. They psychologically get tougher. They become braver. Fewer things bother them. It's not just becoming resistant to life, but there's this flexibility to life that develops. So it's a very powerful thing to know. That whenever you avoid what causes you fear, your world dramatically gets more terrifying, just automatically. So that's the first parenting type. The second parenting type is called the authoritarian parent. Now, the three parts to this guy, very similar to neglecting in the sense of emotions are something not to touch. Emotions are bad. But there's a sharpness, there's an aggression to it. It's not just that we reject emotions, but it's linked to actively suppress. So these sort of parents are critical in how they dismiss emotions, very much lacking empathy. It's like, your kid shows a negative emotion. It's not just you're putting them in the room, putting them in the corner, or ignoring them, but you're making them regret having those feelings in the way you respond. There's a strong emphasis on punishing the child. And usually it's these parents who are most likely to spank, and we're going to get to this more in depth later on, but when you go down that road, it only increases. And I think it's something like 40% of parents who do spank end up at least once in their life spanking their kid in such a way where it falls square within the definition of child abuse. And it's not that these parents are bad, and it's not these parents want to hurt their kid. But what ends up happening is the more a person punishes their kids, the more they spank and use these sort of physical means. It's less that you're training the kid not to misbehave, but it's almost as though you're training yourself to use that particular parenting strategy, and it becomes not just your go-to, but it's something that it draws you into. These parents are very power-oriented. They provide no explanation for what their reasoning is. They tell a kid to do something, it's you listen to me, no questions asked. Why? Because I said so. And in response to kids' feelings, it's almost as if these parents feel like they're being manipulated. It's kind of like, this is like a language of power sort of relationship. And that's worth touching on. It's not just these sort of parents that have that feeling. Most parents think at some point their kid is manipulative. In my field of work, I'm always surprised with, they're not necessarily dealing with kids, but with some of the clients that I see. I see people who suffer from borderline personality disorder. And when I talk to other clinicians, I'm always surprised to hear how much they believe their clients are manipulating them. But what comes with kids who are not as cognitively developed, let's say, or people who are suffering from borderline personality disorder, that's not so obvious that's what's going on. Because to manipulate somebody, what you need to be able to do is to have the sophistication and the clarity of mind to be able to size the person up, figure out, okay, well, what are they likely to do? If I do this, they're likely to do that. If I do this, they're likely to do this. To have this sort of sophisticated prediction. And then to set up the situation in such a way where you're guiding them where you want them to go. Well, that's just not the case with these sorts of people. Whether it's someone who's borderline personality disorder, they're so exquisitely emotionally sensitive to the world around them. Part of it's biological, and part of it is growing up in a hard, invalidating environment, where it's almost kind of like walking around without any skin. Things just hurt. There's a panic. There's a desperation, and when you're in that mindset, you do not have the clarity of mind to be manipulative. It's like you're just trying to survive. And the same thing is with kids. Kids are not developed cognitively enough where they can project themselves into the future like that, and to second guess and to create almost like a web of if this then that sort of thinking on how to manipulate parents. They too are very responsive. They too become overwhelmed emotionally and just react. So it might look like we're being manipulated, but really it's kind of like, brass tacks. Well, you know what? No one enjoys having a kid scream at them. The kid's panicking, and a part of us kind of folds under the pressure of not being able to tolerate that for so long. And, fair enough, even with parents, I'm not suggesting you just kind of sit there and let the kids scream at you. But at the very least, how you look at that is pretty important. And a starting position should be more charitable than being manipulated. Well, maybe this is just lack of control. It's something to watch, something to see, as we're going to get in later on with watching behaviors. It's at these points, it's at these moments, it's most important to observe as much as you can, to make that behavioral map so you can start figuring out how to solve this problem. But it's not manipulation. And the final part of this is a high level of rigidity. This belief that, emotions are something to be controlled, that as the first go-to solution is control. There isn't so much reflective thought. It's more responsive. You broke the rule. There is a repercussion. And it's if you're not gonna measure up to those rules, well, that's the cutoff to punishment. There's a lack of appreciation for context. It could very much be this sort of thing. Well, kids, your daughter might be crying and screaming. Well, she needs your help. Your other kid's in trouble, but that's breaking the rules. That rigidity is found in this sort of parenting type. As far as where this comes from, again, Gottman outlines that a lot of times these sorts of parents grew up in a home where they too were emotionally neglected. It was a sort of this their own training. What they got of their own parents was something along those lines of the only way through is through power and control. Anything else is selfish. It's a very harsh environment that gets translated into the next being put on the next generation. As far as the consequences go, they really are the same as the first that we saw with the neglecting parenting type. But again, not as severe. And again, I think that it's worth kind of noting again that while there is a strong level of avoidance in responding to feelings with such a rigid philosophy, it's still not that level of avoidance we see with the neglecting type. The last of the three ineffective parenting types is the permissive type. This one is on the other side of the spectrum here. As far as how these parents look at their parenting, they're looking at their kids as as almost like they have a right to the freedoms and the feelings they're thinking and feeling. That it's a crime to squelch their creativity, and that the best thing to do is to let kids be. This idea that kids, fundamentally are innocent and pure. And that's something to as much as you can leave untouched. There's this openness without limits. And that comes out, not just in allowing whatever thoughts and feelings the kid has, but comes out behaviorally. There's fewer limits, if any, set on what is behaviorally allowed. Not so many rules at all in the home. The value is to be as warm and as forgiving and as open, communicative, sharing as much as possible. And this almost like it's not a giving up or a helplessness, but it's just this sort of belief, well, what can you do with negative feelings? They're there. They just have to run their course. Often where these parents are coming from is, they're reflecting on the childhoods they had growing up in one of the first two parenting types I already discussed. And what they got out of that experience is, well, I don't want to put that on my kid. I don't want to put those rules that I had to suffer through on him. So there's almost like a guilt or a shame that goes along with this parenting type of that it has to be that kids must be free and must have the experiences that they're having. Because I don't want to put them through the hell I went through. And with this parenting type, the consequences are similar to the other two. But there's more of a sense of being lost, really. That the more open these parents are, the more open these kids are. Well, a part of having rules is giving structure to kids, does enable kids to feel fundamentally safe, that they have the ability to start being able to predict, well, good, there are rules and there are standards that I need to follow, and that gives assurance to kids. They know what to expect. Their future might not be wide open spaces, but it's not something to be terrified of either. there's a calm and a reassurance in knowing what to expect. So these kids are also easily emotionally dysregulated. And even though, they might have a more sophisticated sense of being able to communicate their thoughts and feelings, because that was nurtured, and there is something worthwhile in being able to have that level of, like a type of, encouraging your kids to have a self-discovery of who they are, in a fundamental sort of way. But it's like there's so much room, there's so much openness that, that self-awareness never actually gets translated into being actualized. So you have the same sort of problems socially where, these kids really don't know how to interact with other kids. They don't know how to set the proper boundaries they need to protect themselves and also not put their intense emotions on other people. So those are the three parenting strategies that generate the most harm and unintended harm, because none of these parents are just like I was saying with being manipulative. No parent is setting out thinking, what's the best way to hurt my kid. We're all just trying to get through as best we can, and these three parenting strategies very much do fall in line with certain personality types. So it's just worth kind of like holding that thought a second, because we all love our kids. And while that's a lot right there, and wanting the best for our kids, that is a lot right there. It might not be enough. And if it's enough for some of the kids, it might not be enough for all of the kids. What the research has shown, this fourth parenting type, called the authoritative parenting type, has shown to be extremely effective in helping kids get on the right track and to avoid all those pitfalls I was listing off for you, but maximizes their potential. That the authoritative parenting type predicts success in school, predicts success in the workplace. It predicts having a good marriage. It predicts, they themselves going on to having a close, meaningful relationship with their kids. Being able to emotionally regulate themselves, to be able to catch social cues, and to be a productive member of their community. And this sort of parenting strategy has been shown across the board in every culture to be the most effective. Not just in Western cultures, but from Japan to South America to Europe. Every culture, this really seems to be the right path. And what's kind of cool about this one is it's really taking the best from all the other different parenting strategies. That those other parenting strategies alone, whether it be this high demandingness that we were seeing in the more aggressive parenting strategy, or this very high acceptance that we were seeing with the permissive strategy, those are very damaging. But it's almost kind of a paradox that when you put them together, that's what maximizes parenting. That's what maximizes success with your kids. That we are having strong demands, and there are rules, and we do expect our kids to live up to certain standards in the home, and specific standards that they're aware of. And what comes out is, when that's balanced with high acceptance and a responsiveness to feelings, not trying to push them away, not trying to run away from them, we get the best that order has to offer. That there is structure, there is predictability, there are consequences to actions. That helps mold kids in being able to know that, well, they can have standards put on them, and they can have expectations to live up to, and they can live up to them. Making life more predictable. I mean, a part of this is the more predictable you can make things in the home, the easier it is that kids end up learning, oh, well, when I do this, good things happen. When I do that, bad things happen. And they can take, it's almost like these sort of like general rules of life, and they can take that into their adulthood. One way of looking at being a parent is, well, it's almost like we're society's representative, except we're a lot nicer than society's going to be. And that sure, kids do make mistakes. And being parents, loving our kids, we're not gonna try and needlessly make our kids suffer over the mistakes they're gonna make. But we do have to put into place this expectation. Well, there are expectations. Other people are gonna want, not that they want something out of you, but like they kind of do want something out of you. They want you to be able to participate and play nicely. They do expect you to follow the rules. And so this sort of high demand gives over that skill to kids. There are behaviors that are expected, and there are behaviors you better not do. So that's one part of this. And like I said, the other part of this is this high responsiveness to feelings, this permissiveness to whatever you feel. That we as parents are open and warm and inviting to our kids and how they feel. That we can support them in the tough emotions they're having, and also support them and celebrate the positive emotions they're having. And this permissiveness, this responsiveness to our kids' emotions, well, this is really where we're able to develop them as individuals. Kind of getting back to the idea last week of, kids need to be able to be good members of the group, but they also have to be individuals as well, and know when to step out of the group and make a stand for the values that we hope they'll take on, that we pass on to them. And it's this balance between the two. Well, the way to do that is through having demands. They do figure out how to get on with society, but by being permissive and being open to exploring their emotional world, that enables them to figure out who they are as individuals, and what they have to offer uniquely to the rest of the world. And it's not as though these two things are two separate skills, two separate modes of being, but they really have to go together. It's that every feeling is okay, and not every behavior is okay, and they go hand in hand. And we do have to lay down the law. Again, we're going to get into how to effectively set limits and get into punishing. And there are going to be times where we have to lay down the law. But unlike the other parenting types, it's not coercive. It's not with brute force. And that we do set rules, but those rules are negotiable. There's something to these rules that they have to have a certain level of flexibility. And we invite discussion with our kids. And I mean, that's even kind of cool, because a lot of parents kind of think about this as, like almost like they're encouraging their kids to not listen or be chutzpahdik. And done poorly, you might actually get that outcome. But what we're shooting for is almost kind of like inviting kids to be a partner in the process of following these rules. It's almost like inviting them into the lab, figuring out, well, how do rules work, and how to negotiate the different wants and desires both parties have. Well, that's a really good skill to have in life, of being able to negotiate. You want your kids to be able to do that. And, if we have the high expectations we do, and the high openness to their feelings, well, they never really end up turning into these chutzpahdik monsters we're worried about. And they're able to take those skills and mix it with being able to negotiate tough situations. Well, those sorts of kids become amazing in society. That's the sort of person you want on your team. That's the sort of person you want to marry. Someone who can compromise. So kind of put another way, fitting this into the skills we're going to be learning, with this sort of parenting type, this sort of parenting philosophy. We want high nurturance. And this is going to be the emotion coaching aspect of the course, where we are supportive and accepting. We are responsive and we are warm to the feelings our kids are having, no matter how terrible they might be. And in a certain way, it's also kind of this sort of openness to feeling. We're also showing our kids tough emotions aren't going to eat you alive. Again, they're not something to be feared. There's something that, well, once they're not something that's to be feared, well, you can start being a little curious about it. There's something to learn from those tough emotions, and there definitely is. Anger, in many ways, its function is to tell you there's an injustice in the world. And you need to be able to recognize anger early on so that it doesn't consume you and turn into disgust. That's a tough emotion to put on somebody. That we're able to recognize anger early on, to see the injustice, to see what needs to be fixed, what's in front of you, and then to do it. That's an important piece of information. Or being sad. Its function is to tell you, hey, well, you lost something. You're missing something. To take an accounting of, well, how did you lose it? And to tread carefully because, well, being sad, you kind of have this feeling of not wanting to push forward in life. Well, and I'm not talking about being depressed, but, it is, sadness does kind of pump the brakes a little bit. Being sad does pump the brakes a little bit. Having the person take stock of what just occurred. And even think about, well, okay, there was a loss. Maybe there's another way of being, or there's something else that the kid can do to replace that loss. To take the time to be self-reflective in the way that sadness kind of asks us to be. So we don't want to get rid of those emotions. We want those emotions to be there because they give something to life. They enrich life. The second part to this again, this high demand, well, that's the regulation of behavior, what we're going to be getting into with the parent management training part of this course. That there are reasonable expectations that do need to be put on kids, and we are going to be, as parents, we are going to be willing to use force to set those standards and make sure that the kids do measure up, but in a way that we're not tyrants. In a way that we're not punishing in this almost like vengeful sort of way. But being able to keep an eye on how rules, how restrictions have this sort of paradoxical result of bringing forth creativity and bringing forth, personal greatness. And by using these two different skills, that we're replacing manipulation. We're replacing this permissiveness. Tempering it, and maybe is a better way of thinking about it. So the kids can self-actualize. But they have the skills to do that. Marriage. The quality of our marriage is a key factor in how our kids turn out. It's not fair. It's hard kind of putting that on our kids. It's kind of, it... I don't know, I just almost kind of I have a lot of sympathy for this, kind of thinking, well, it's hard enough having problems in a marriage. It's hard enough feeling alienated by your spouse and, fighting with them and being in conflict, not being able to open up to them. That's hard enough. But man, it's not just an added indignity. It's it has this almost this sort of like feeling of helplessness, that the quality of our marriage then has to be transferred over to our kid. So it's like almost like a collateral damage. Yeah, it's a tough one. So I think it's worthwhile stopping to kind of look at marriage. Even though this class is not exactly designed for specifically targeting those problems, but it's worth touching on to kind of get a general sense of the playing field there, and what should be avoided and what can be done in a more general sense to kind of and maybe kind of push forward and get reoriented. This isn't a marriage course, and marriage is complicated. Even though I'm kind of zipping through this material, I don't want to give the impression as though like I'm giving the solution to problems and conflicts in marriage. But it is worth touching on because, how the quality of our marriage does influence very dramatically how our kids are turning out. It's a huge factor in the sort of problems that do come up emotionally and behaviorally with kids. Up until recently, there's been a lot of bad research. I really even hesitate to use the word research, but a lot of bad beliefs regarding marriage. Just to give an example, it wasn't so long ago, you had therapists who their theory was kind of based on getting negative emotions out there, expressing negative emotions. So what they do is it's an interesting idea, they bring in couples and their theory was, like I said, well, just the more aggressive they are, the more open they are, the more forthright they are, well, just the better, just get it out. And so they give both couples foam baths, and the therapy would amount to something like one spouse yelling at the other their grievance or what they want or what they feel they're owed, and whacking them with this foam bat. And then the other would return the favor. It was an interesting theory. Unsurprisingly, it didn't work out so well. So it isn't until recently that there is good research, there is good data on what makes a good marriage. And another myth that used to be put out there is that you need to have the right type of character in the marriage. And that didn't turn out to be true either. Or roughly speaking, there's 3 types of couples that exist. One is the volatile couple. Like I said, researchers have horrible ways of labeling these. But but the first is about the volatile couple. In this couple, they're very open, they're very emotional, they put things out there, they're willing to fight, and they fight it out. Emotions are there to be expressed, and you don't. It's not just that you go to sleep it's not just that you don't go to sleep angry at each other, but you don't go to sleep until you've fought it out and there's a conclusion. This is the volatile type. And they're also very much, this sort of couple's characterized by this sort of sense that it's us against the world. And it works. Being married to someone who's volatile just like you, they speak your language. That's okay. To the surprise of everybody, showing anger doesn't hurt a marriage. We'll come back to that one in a second because, while anger doesn't hurt a marriage, there's plenty of other things that do. And we're going to outline that. So that's the volatile type. The second is the validating type. This is the sort of couple that, they generally try and seek compromise. They're not necessarily afraid to share their beliefs, but there's a line. Conflict needs to be at the right place and the right time. In moderation. And this sort of couple is, the best way to describe them is that they're companions, they're chums. They're not as intense as the first, but they're also not as close. I don't know, close, maybe that's not the right way of putting it, but this sort of intense we-ness is not there. And again, I kind of want to make it clear. It's not to say that one couple type loves each other more than the other. That's not it. That's not it. It's really how do these two people, how are they put together? I mean, that's really more the idea of this one. And the last type is a conflict avoiding type. These couples, they never have a throwdown. Every disagreement, it's best for them to be unsaid. These couples, they agree they agree to disagree. They very much are affirming their feelings. They are affirming their love. They're affirming their togetherness. And like I said, it's not that one marriage type is more loving than the other, but the emphasis is highlighting to the extreme the common ground between these two people. So even though, yes, they can be, emotionally clear or expressive, but it's toned down. It's low key. It's tempered. That's probably a good way of thinking about it. And each couple type works. You start to run into trouble when you start mixing and matching. It does become more easy for there to be problems, say if the husband's more volatile and the wife is avoidant. The husband looks at the wife as, being a spineless fish. Tell me what you really think. Why don't you open up? And the wife looks at the husband like a scary tyrant. Why are you yelling all the time? Why is everything so emotional all the time? And you will run into problems when you have this mismatch of personality type. But even there, it's not the end of the world. And even in those sort of marriages, both if they can figure out how to laugh that part off, they really do love each other dramatically and intimately. This is not where the problems in marriage lie. John Gottman, he was one of the main researchers really spearheading this idea, really trying to clean up the research that existed in the field of marital therapy. His idea was, okay, right. So we have all these interesting theories, and there's some basis to them in psychology, and fair enough. But let's put those theories to the side. Let's see what makes a good marriage. So what he did was he set something up called the Love Lab. He had an apartment and he rigged the whole place with cameras, with sensors. They were taking, and you'd sit in a chair and the chair itself was taking, was measuring your, was fixed up, it was fixed up with different measurement tools, taking heart rate and oxygen content in the blood. You're really being observed. You're being put under the microscope in this apartment. And people would come in and they'd spend time in this apartment, couples, whether it be for a day or a weekend or, even a couple week period, and they're being observed the entire time. No cameras in the bathroom, but, short of that, privacy is being respected, but they're being observed the entire time. And so what Gottman did was just by observing these couples and then running them through a rigorous assessment afterwards, they figured out, well, what behaviors actually make a marriage good? What specific behaviors predict divorce? So what they came out with was there were really 4 different behaviors that predict divorce, and within a 90% plus degree of accuracy. There's getting an assessment by John Gottman, more or less, and with his approach, you more or less, within by the end of that assessment, you can figure out where this marriage is going. That's how specific this is. So what predicts divorce? What are the behaviors to avoid? And what are their antidotes? So like I said before, anger is not inherently bad. There's a lot of good to be learned from anger. It motivates us to solve the problems that we're confronted with. But there is a huge difference between anger and criticism and contempt. These two behaviors are the attack behaviors that can really ruin a marriage. So criticism is really just, it's any statement that implies there's something globally wrong with your spouse. That there's some sort of, deficit in who they are. These sort of criticisms, are usually going to begin with "you always" or "you never." And if we're going to predict how this one ends, they usually are going to be followed up by the other spouse being defensive, which is another one of the four horsemen. It's good to kind of get down here, the difference between criticism and an honest complaint is, as a complaint, you do need to, it can be out of anger. You do need to be able to express, I feel a certain way. I feel angry. And that you're describing a behavior you don't like coming from your spouse. I am hangry. That you don't put your socks away. And needs to be followed up with a request. I really want you to put those socks away. And that's okay. That's not criticism. Here what separates criticism as opposed to, you're always leaving those stupid socks everywhere, all over the place. Why don't you just get it? Get it through your thick skull. In version 1, it's almost like you're just stating the facts. You're a simple newspaper reporter, and you're listing off the who, what, where, when. Staying away from the how and the why. That's more criticism. But you're putting the facts on the table and clearly giving an instruction, something that could actually realistically be understood and followed. Whereas criticism, that's not the newspaper reporter, that's the editorialist. The how and the why. Attributing the unseen intent. Explaining the behaviors as being, well, there's something wrong with you as a person. As opposed to just allowing the behavior to be what was. I see socks on the floor. That's a fact. When I see the socks on the floor, it's a fact. I get upset by that. I'm not accusing you of wanting me to be upset. I'm not accusing you of attacking me. I'm not accusing ill intent. I don't know what's in your head. I'm asking you, could you please pick up the socks? A practical request that can solve the problem. And, taking that strategy, that being one antidote, goes a long way in solving those problems. The other antidote to this one is something called soft startups. Of not diving in to the problems that confront the couple. Listen, is this a good time? I'd like to talk to you about something that's really been bothering me. That's a soft start. That's a soft startup. Honey, I just want you to know, I see you've been working hard, and I love you. There's nothing wrong with you. I just want to talk about something that's been on my mind. Is that okay with you? It's more than just putting forward a good foot. It's showing to your partner that you have faith in the relationship. You have faith in them. You expect them to be a good person. And you have a problem that you want to sort out. And it's when you invite the other person to be the good spouse that they really are, that's when they're the good spouse they really are. They live up to that standard. Contempt is very similar to criticism. The difference it seems to be more of an issue of intensity and degree. It's not just there's something wrong with your spouse. You always leave those socks everywhere. Get with the program. But it has this added feel of, and they're beneath you because that's what they are. It's a feeling of, I'm better than you. You disgust me that you leave your socks all over the place. I don't know how I put up with you. The antidote to contempt, to the end, to the mockery, to the put downs that aren't just like in the heat of the moment, but they're really just trying to. It's almost like the put downs are deserved. The antidote to this one is trying to build a culture of appreciation around those sorts of moments. These are really deeply intense emotional, I don't want to say experiences, but that doesn't quite capture the what's going on here. But there's this raw emotion. It is really hard to just stop in the moment. It's more you have to try and figure out how to, in the rest of your life, create this sense of we-ness, to create this sense of appreciation, to create this sense of togetherness and love. And it's setting up that environment that ends up protecting a person from being contemptuous. Now you might end up slipping up and being critical, but there's so much more in the relationship that just screams that this is a beautiful person. How could you ever be disgusted by them? That's the antidote. So it's being willing to invest the time in going out every week on a date. Creating rituals within the family every day, sitting down at breakfast and supper together. If you can manage lunch too. Sharing your day, having that interest. Being a person your spouse can come to and just unload their problems. And the last thing you'd ever do is side with the enemy. Even if the enemy's right, you're the safe haven for your spouse. That's the antidote to contempt. The last two of the four horsemen are defensiveness and stonewalling. These are escape tactics. As far as defensiveness goes, like I said, that follows criticism. That definitely follows contempt. But what defensiveness fundamentally is it's shutting down the conversation. Whatever you're saying is not correct. Not at all. It's drawing a line in the sand, almost kind of like setting things up where, you're the victim and your spouse is the aggressor. It's not just making excuses. It's not just, explaining away your behavior. I didn't really mean to, that's not what I meant. You're misinterpreting me. Sometimes defensiveness, almost has this, it also takes on as, the counterattack is another type of defensiveness. The last thing that's going to happen is I'm going to accept any influence here on your part. I'm right and you're not. This is defensiveness. And then you're wrong for even accusing me. Well, the antidote to this one is accepting influence, trying to strive to find some common ground. Now it might be impossible for you to say, honey, you're 100% right. But at the very least, trying to figure out something that your spouse is saying that, that you're willing to consider, at the very least, even saying, could you give me some time to think that one over? I want to hear you out. Just give me a second. I want to think about that one. Who could argue with that? I had a story a while back. I was giving a lecture and I was trying to find parking And so I was out near the first train station, and they were having this huge event, and there was no parking, and if you keep driving through the parking lot, it's a pretty big parking lot, and every spot was full. You keep driving, you end up getting this gravel road area, and I'm following this car. See a parking spot right off to the right, and he turns left for whatever reason. It's like, great, this parking spot's mine. I slip in. Great, I'm not going to be late. I get a knock on the window. The guy had gotten out of his car and started telling me I took his parking spot. I giving a lot of classes, working with a lot of different people with this skill. And definitely using it in my own life, in my own marriage. I just had it drilled into me. All right, I hear you out. Let me think about that. So he knocks. This is my parking spot, those were the first words out of my mouth. The guy just looks at me like, I wasn't expecting you to be so open, It really surprised him. I was taking him seriously. And, to be honest, I wasn't. My first emotional reaction was, are you joking me? This is my parking spot. But I had drilled this one enough into me that my body acted first and my mind could follow it. And I did put some thought into it. And I realized, well, this guy's turning left because, well, wait a second. No, he really wants to park here, but he's one of those guys who does the reverse parking. Okay, fine. So I let him have the parking spot. 2 seconds later, I found another one just ahead. I guess I'm kind of sharing this story to kind of, put out there that by having this sort of outline, knowing where you can get tripped up and knowing what the antidotes are, just a simple matter of drilling that into you, practicing it in the mirror, doing it over and over and over, getting that practice, and no matter what, you want to get your body to react first and allow your mind and emotions to follow. So they can be almost kind of, not that you're tricking yourself, but you're kind of tricking yourself into doing the right thing and to be committed to doing the right thing. Because, I'll tell you, like in these sort of situations, when you're deep in conflict, the way we're made, the way memory works even is very state dependent. So it's like when you're angry at your spouse, good luck trying to remember the day you guys got married. Good luck trying to remember, why you marry this person, why you love them, what about them gives you joy. Because our memories are emotion state dependent. When we're angry, we're only able to really access all those memories of when we were angry. That's why, when your wife's ticked off at you, she has a laundry list of criticisms and upset that she just throws at you. And so do you. But there again, it's pretty hard to bring those to memory when you guys are really close and really having a good time together. So by training in these sort of behaviors, really getting into yourself, okay, don't be defensive. I hear what you're saying. Give me a second to think about it. It saves you. It saves you and lets you be the person you want if you had the choice. The last one here, stonewalling. Definitely defensiveness is more of a male trait, but women do it too. But when it comes to stonewalling, most of the time, this is a problem that men have. And this one's different. Stonewalling is really, it's when you see the other spouse, they're upset. There's criticism after criticism. And you see everything you're saying isn't working. What ends up happening is a person gets flooded. Literally, the blood drains out of their prefrontal cortex, the part of their brain that's their analytic thinking part of their brain. They start to panic. They don't see clearly what's going on. They're not as articulate. You might even be, when you fall into stonewalling, when you become flooded, you might even start, not that you're blacking out, but it's almost like life skipping a beat. So what ends up happening is the person just stops talking. They stop looking at their spouse. They're hunkering down. It's almost like they're going into the bunker, waiting for the air raid to finish because nothing they're doing is working. There is good intention behind this one, but the repercussions are fierce, because ultimately what stonewalling is doing is, well, your spouse who's angry and wants you to love them and wants you to be there and help and show caring. Well, man, they were just abandoned, and so just things get worse through stonewalling. And again, like I said, this one's biological. You can the surest way you can tell that you're flooded, that you're going through this overwhelmed, biological process. Just take a minute and take your heartbeat. For men, when they have 80 beats per minute, is an indication they're flooded. And for women, it's 90. A little bit of a difference there, but and this is an indication. Wait a second, there's a problem. And well, the antidote here is really self-soothing. Taking time to say, just a second, recognizing you're feeling flooded and saying to your spouse, well, just you know what, honey, just give me a second here. I want to take time to just kind of relax and cool off. Can we take a 10-minute break? I want to come back to you, but I'm just too overwhelmed. And for your wife, like I said, it's usually the husband that's stonewalling, but for your wife to also take on to be on the lookout for when stonewalling hits. Like I said, they're less likely to become flooded. So it's a kindness for one's wife, or like I said, sometimes it's also, the man can take this position. It's a kindness to be on the lookout for when your spouse looks like they're flooded, to give them the time to collect themselves, because again, it's this feeling of like nothing I'm doing is working, and 9 times out of 10 in a fight, well, we do really want things to work out well, and it's a shame having both hands tied behind your back while fighting. So, in summing up these 4 horsemen, I hope these antidotes can be of use, but I not to be overly pessimistic, but marriage is tough. Research in this field shows that 15 to 20% of couples feel like their marriage is satisfying, that they're happy with the marriage they have. Most couples aren't, because it is so easy to fall into these 4 habits, these four horsemen. And it's even more complicated than that, because a part of this that Gottman was able to uncover in his long-term studies on the couples he was following is that 70% of the problems that exist in a marriage, they're perpetual. They're not going away. So, you're tracking couples for 20 years, 30 years. The clothes you wear change. The type of hairstyle changes. For men, you might have less hair the longer the study goes. But one thing that doesn't change are the perpetual fights the couple first came in with 20 years before. So that's worth knowing, because, having in mind these 4 horsemen, and these 4 antidotes, they go a long way in solving a lot of problems. And they go a long way in treating perpetual problems differently also. But you also need to know, it might just be that it's going to be for the rest of your life. Those socks are always going to be strewn across the living room floor. That's just the way it's going to be. And so the final antidote, it's not ignoring, it's not resigning yourself, but it's developing the sense of this open acceptance and even humor around the things that really irk us about the person we're married to. And as far as our kids go, seeing these statistics, seeing how, fights happen, and man, they happen. We can't shield our kids away from these fights. But we have to show them that it's not their fault. The research bears out really decisively. I mean, just all the problems that come out of parents fighting, really are mirroring the same problems that we were discussing with the other parenting types. On top of the depression, on top of the anxiety that comes out of it. Well, the best surefire way to protect your kids and really protect your kids from this problem, from having to suffer those consequences, is after the fight, sitting down with your kid, both you and your spouse, and telling your kids, Mom and Dad was having a fight. We worked it out, but we just wanted you to know our fight was not because of you. It's not your fault we were fighting. It's not because kids are selfish or self-centered, but they really do look at the world as though they're the center of it, that they're the reference point. And again, not because they're selfish, not because they're self-centered. It's just they don't have the sophistication to see that that life in the world is it's too complex to describe. There's a lot of complexity to life. And so they kind of simplify life's complexity by just having this rule, this heuristic, whatever happens is because of me. And it's not such a bad rule to have. I'm trying to remember, there was the name of the story. It was T.S. Eliot wrote this story. It was like one of his short stories about, this lady who was at a cocktail party, and she strikes up a conversation with a psychologist. And somewhere in the conversation, she's sharing her problems and, all the different things that she's going through. And she says, there's kind of almost this throwaway comment, that she sure hopes it's her fault. And it's really took the psychologist aback. Like, well, man, what do you mean? You wish it was your fault? I mean, these are really tough problems. Well, she said, listen, I figure it's something like this. That if it's the world that's at fault, I'm done for. There's nothing I can do. But if I take on that it's me that's at fault, well, I'm in a better position because I know I can sure fix myself. So it is a good rule, thinking that our problems have something to do with us. And like I said, life's complex. Even if it's mostly the environment, you definitely have a part to play in that environment. And so it is good that, as a rule, kids kind of have that. And it does help them manage their lives and helps them out a lot. But when it's something as safety destroying as mom and dad fighting, I mean, mom and dad are the bedrock of a family. I mentioned, I had done research. I had done some research recently, a couple years back here in Yerushalayim. I was able to list 40 participants, which just enough to say it's an exploratory research project, just enough that the outcomes will be statistically significant, that you can learn something from it. Got 40 participants, and what I did was I had to take the assessments you guys are taking, the Gottman marital assessment and the Eichenbach assessment for the kids. And the research, it pointed, clearly, just like every other research project pointed out, that when there's problems with the couple, there's problems with the kids. What came out was that out of all the things I was assessing for, and you guys saw the assessment, Gottman's marital assessment is pretty descriptive, love maps, how much do you know about your spouse? How much fondness and admiration is there? Do you guys, are you guys sharing your life experiences, even however, briefly with each other? Is there this overwhelming sense, this positive sentiment, this overwhelming sense of, I think well of you? I'm just going through the list, you guys took the assessment. What came out was really interesting, that it wasn't every single one of these qualities that went into being protective of one's kids. But it was really only the things that really spoke to security, not so much love, that was more important to the kid's sense of well-being and things are okay and emotional stability and emotional well-being than anything else. It was, that there isn't any flooding, that there is no gridlock and fighting, that repair attempts, are made and they're successful, that both parents are emotionally engaged with one another. It's not like they're two ships passing in the night. And then it was these skills that really predicted positive outcomes with the kids. A sense that things are safe. Again, this idea, mom and dad fight, but it's not your fault. The kids are safe. And what I thought was really interesting about this research was, seeing, well, how tough things look in the Haredi population. There were strengths. Compromise, for example, was a big strength, but there were a lot of deficits. And that got me thinking about, well, why is it? It was kind of odd even, that there was so much compromise going on. And clearly, the spouses, did like each other, there was something there. So why were there so many problems? Especially the last one about, emotional disengagement. It even came out, the longer people were married, there was this trend that the longer they were married, the less they ended up knowing about their spouse. This is serious. What it seemed to be was almost like, it almost reminded me of where couples were being successful was exactly the things that were most emphasized in the Chassan and Kala courses. Being mevater, compromising. And that's important. Being like Rivka, with the story of Eliezer coming and, not just compromising, but being mevater, being willing to give to the other person. That really is important. That is vital to a marriage. But it's not the only thing. And it actually doesn't predict good outcomes with kids either. It seemed like, that there were a lot of well-intentioned, well-meaning people, couples who want to make it work, but just didn't have the tools to learn how to fight. And that seems to kind of be, that was my takeaway with my research. What was lacking was, seeing square in the face that, we fight, and avoiding it's not an answer. But learning how to fight well is. And again, I hope those antidotes to the Four Horsemen, I think, really go a long way in learning how you can't avoid fights, but you need to learn how to fight well. Now, that's the key. The other thing that was really shocking to me about this research was, like I said, the Eichenbach, as I talked about last week, the Eichenbach assessment is used in research frequently. So you have, standardized scores in, all around the world. And what was surprising was looking at, when non-clinical, non-referred people are taking this test, people who are not seeing therapists, people who are not having, problems necessarily. This is just like a nice chunk of the normal general population. Well, what are their scores? Well, you put those alongside the scores that I was seeing with the kids, and it wasn't looking so good. The aggression scores were double. The anxiety and depression were extreme. The only score that wasn't as big as the secular American population was delinquency. So that should really give us pause of just how important it really is to learn how to fight well. Because, like I said, learning how to fight well, showing that your kids are safe, that mom and dad are together, that they're living as partners, not just, like I said, two ships passing in the night. It's not just mom's at home and dad's in Kolel. It might be that, there's not so much time, that, dads do need to be Kolel and moms do, they're taking care of kids. That's not the point, but it's that it's a shared mission together, that both mom and dad are together on this one. The sense of shared meaning, that's what's important. Being able to communicate that to your kids. Showing them fighting is okay. They're not in danger. That's what goes that's what goes in as far as keeping kids safe from anxiety and depression and all this other stuff that correlates with problems at home. Okay. Well, I think actually, I think it makes most sense for saving for next week. Chain analysis. Next week we're going to really now dive into parent management training. We're going to start with learning the behavioral techniques, getting into the ABCs of parenting, and it might just make more sense to put those skills there. So, thank you, and we'll pick it up. We'll pick it up next week.